There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Hey, everybody out there listening. Welcome to another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms. I've got, as most often is the case, Nephi Cole sitting with me.
Hey, how you doing, Dave?
You know, I'm all right. I'm all right.
You know what the best part about right now is?
What's that?
We're in Mike's house, and no one's here but us.
And Mike's not here.
When this is over, we're going to the fridge. We're just going to find out what's in there.
I'm not even convinced Mike exists anymore. He's like some sort of figment of our imagination. Like he was just this imaginary guy.
I hope this is still his house.
I haven't
Wouldn't
seen
it
it
be
go on the
weird if
market.
Yeah,
I mean, I see a picture of
his kids.
his kids,
They're
but
on the
not
desk here.
him. So I just don't
his
know.
His picture's not even in here.
No, it's like I haven't seen him in so long.
Those are his kids, right?
Those look like his kids. Yeah. But anyway, he's not here.
Oh, well.
It's just us, and we're going to have to carry this show again, right?
I guess we'll try.
Hope he figures out how to rejoin us one of these days. It'd be good to have him on a show, maybe as a guest.
Yeah, too much vacationing for you, Mike McGrady.
Yeah, way too much. Maybe I'm a little jealous. Maybe I'm not. I don't know. But he's missed. We'll soldier on as we frequently do. This is the benefit of having three people working this show is when somebody's gone, others can pick up the slack. And so we're picking up the slack for Mike yet again. Mike, if you're listening, which I hope you are.
You won't listen.
No, I know.
It's okay.
Anyway, for those of you that are listening, thanks for tuning in again. I'm going to start this off the way I normally have been ending it with the ask. You know, the ask of everybody out there listening. And I'm going to ask two things. One, first of all, please, if you haven't already, hit subscribe wherever you're getting this podcast. And give us, if you haven't yet, give us a rating. Those are the things that help keep us going because we are certainly not making piles of money off of this thing. Knowing that we're providing content that you enjoy listening to is what keeps us going.
Yep, it's just ego.
100%. And two, if you have ideas for a podcast, things that you'd like to hear us talk about, email us, let us know. Send them to yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com, or you can message us through our social media platforms, either Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at the handle @itsyourmountain. And as proof that we take recommendations seriously when they come in, we had somebody recently email us and said, "Hey, I'm curious about your take on the new director of the Bureau of Land Management." And for those of you that don't know, that this has happened, we're going to go into detail. Basically, we got this email asking us to do this, and so we're going to do it.
Because it's not yet irrelevant, because 120 days haven't passed. So if you're listening to this 3-4 months from now, trust us. We'll be doing it all over again.
For somebody else.
Yes.
Right? So let's talk about that really quick. So this is what this episode is going to be about, really, is about the new, I don't even know if I'm going to call him the interim director, because really what he is, this is William Perry Pendley is his name. He was brought on in July to be the Deputy Director of Policy and Programs for the BLM. And shortly thereafter, he was, through a secretarial order, he was named he basically added on to his title. He became the, I don't know what is it's like the Deputy Director of these, acting with the authority of the director. So he's, in essence, overseeing BLM. He's the director, kind of an interim director.
So he was at Interior, and somebody grabbed a new nameplate and brought it over his desk and dropped it on top of it.
He was at Interior for like 2 days. I think that's important to know where did he come from, right? Do we want to know where he came from, right? So this isn't his first time in Interior. Let's talk about, before we talk about the move and what it means, let's introduce you to William Pendley. Right? So William Pendley is actually, his title is, he's the Bureau of Land Management's Deputy Director for Policy and Programs, exercising authority of the director. First of all, that's a full business card. It's a lot of print on a business card.
Yep.
But so he's an attorney. He actually got his start decades and decades ago. He's originally born and raised in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So he's from here. He's from where we're recording. Right.
This house.
Did you know that?
This house?
No, this house has only been in existence for 10 years. But did you know that he was from Cheyenne?
I did. I did not.
Yeah.
I did not.
So now you do.
You're from Cheyenne, right?
I am.
Okay, I'm just checking.
Yeah.
I live here.
So he is too. Born and raised. He got his bachelor's degree and master's degrees in economics and political science from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He was in the United States Marine Corps, and then after service to his country, he received his Juris Doctorate, his law degree, from the University of Wyoming College of Law. And while he was there, he was the senior editor of the Land and Water Law Review. And for those of you that haven't gone to law school, the reason I'm telling you this, the reason this is important is if you haven't gone to law school, being the senior editor of a law review is a pretty big deal. It means that you're a very good student. You're one of the best students in your class.
Were you the senior editor of the?
I actually turned down law review.
I'm just checking, Dave.
Yeah.
I want to see.
So I never had a chance to become the senior editor because I was never a junior editor. So I never did law review. I've written law review articles, but I was not on the law review board. You were just trying to
trying to make some kind. I was just trying to go there was a rabbit hole there. I felt like maybe it could be entertaining, but it was not.
You were gonna do something about
there was really
making fun of my GPA and. But my point of saying all this before we get into the discussion about him, because there's controversy around his appointment to this position. The reason for bringing this up is this is a smart man. This is an intelligent individual, right? He's very bright. He's been practicing law for decades. He worked he was an attorney for Wyoming Senator Clifford Hansen. There are buildings named after this senator, right?
Yeah, he was also a governor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in fact, his grandson was governor, I believe, also.
It may have been.
Guy named Meade.
Yeah, rumor has it, right?
Yeah, so interesting.
So he was an attorney for our old boss's grandfather, right? That's pretty interesting, right?
Small world.
It's a very small world. He was also an attorney to the House Interior and Insular Affairs Committee. During the Reagan administration, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy and Minerals of the Department of Interior. And he also was a consultant to the former Secretary of the Navy. And he was engaged in private practice of law in the D.C. area before, in the late 80s, he became president of the Mountain States Legal Foundation. That was the capacity in which he served until he was tapped for this position within Interior today.
He's been there a long time at that legal foundation.
30 years.
Yeah.
He's been heading up the Mountain States Legal Foundation. And I don't know if you want to talk at all about what the Mountain State Legal Foundation is.
Sure. Let's just briefly cover it.
We can do it very quickly. I mean, it's the short answer is it's a conservative policy and legal organization that helps the farming and ranching community and other industries in the West, in particular in the West, deal with conflicts with the federal government, right? I mean, that's they work on NEPA issues, endangered species issues, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. They are in the same way that you'd think of Earth Justice as an environmental law firm trying to hold the federal government accountable. Mountain States Legal Foundation is a law firm trying to hold the federal government accountable
for a different set of interests.
Okay. For sure. Right. And so that's where he's been the past 30 years. Well, he was brought into this role, and before we talk about the controversial nature of it, the other thing you should know about it is, and you're well aware, I'm well aware, right? Typically, the way this process works for a BLM director is the President of the United States would nominate somebody to serve as the director of the Bureau of Land Management. That name would be sent to the Senate, to the Environment and Public Works Committee, typically, for confirmation, and then it would go to the Senate floor for a vote, and then that person would be put in place as the director. It is a presidential appointee, Senate-confirmed position.
And there's only so much time somebody can serve in the temporary capacity in that position before going in front of the Senate for confirmation.
That is correct. That is correct. So he has not been nominated to be the director. Nobody has been nominated to be the director of BLM.
So how many have we had cycle through BLM in that acting capacity over the last
2.5 years?
Yes.
I don't know the
I was
answer.
actually looking at my watch because I was
saw
trying
you
to
do
do it in
that.
hours.
I saw you doing that. I don't know the answer to that. It's been several.
Yes.
It's been several. And he's the latest. And I can tell you, based on the secretarial order that put him in that position, this acting with the authority, that authority expires on September 30th of this year.
So that means Land County only has till September 30th to fundraise on that name. You'd better get moving.
Are you calling out the backcountry hunters and anglers call to action here?
We're going to have to haul. We're going to have to crush it until September 30th because.
So the big fear and what you've just teed up there, I think.
Yeah, I'm just kidding. I'm joking. Please, there's a lot of that is joking.
Yeah, we know Land, right? He can take a joke. I think we'll find out. We'll find out. But I think the reason you mentioned that is because of the controversy around the nomination. So Mr. Pendley has a history, and I think it's safe to say this is the history he has. He has a history of being, I don't know if the right way to say it is anti-public lands. That's what a lot of folks, that's what the backcountry hunters and anglers, and frankly, a lot of folks in the sportsman's community and the conservation community will say the same thing, that he's anti-public lands.
But anti-public lands in this case doesn't mean that if there's public lands, like anti-public lands meaning
he's been a proponent. He's written it down. He's been a proponent of both the transfer and the sale of public lands,
of federal lands to
federal
other
lands
entities,
to the state or private enterprise.
Yeah, and so when I say that, the reason I say that is to try and understand that there's a segment of individuals who have, where this argument, we always say it's. I'm trying to find a way to frame it up, but this legal, the paradigm of thinking there, where does that come from? What is the world? What is the view of the universe that lends you to think that it should be A versus B? But yeah, he's always been B.
Right. He's always been in the camp of it's never been in. It's never.
This argument that
the
it's
federal government,
constitutional,
that the federal government has never been in the position where it's supposed to be holding these massive amounts of land, right? His position was that it was the intent of Congress since the founders that we transfer land from the federal government to the public.
And I guess the reason I'm saying that is just so people understand that the worldview that they're coming from there is this idea of limited government type of worldview. And so why would the federal government need to be larger by having these huge tracts of lands that they should manage? And the thought that, well, then these should be somebody else's job to take care of because we don't need this larger federal, bureaucracies managing this federal state. Why should we do that? Let's make the federal government supposed to be tiny. So this concept, this thought that when that from the beginning, this thing didn't need to exist, that the federal government should be much smaller. So that's the kind of thread that comes from, the originalist concept. Is that making sense?
I think that's part of it.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to go down two paths.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right.
I'm really tired.
So let me.
though. Just you.
Okay, so I'll see
Because
what I can do about carrying it.
I drove like all night to get back here to do this podcast with you today.
I know you did. My mind's not in the right place either, too, because
I know. I'm really sorry.
I just came here from the vet and found out that we're gonna have to put down our dog later this week, and that was my wife and I got that as a way to fend off having kids for a little bit longer.
Well, you failed.
Some almost 13 and a half years ago. So she's a yellow lab and she's got a lot of cancer, and so my mind's not in a great place either, but we're going to try and push through this, right?
Sorry, brother.
Yeah, well.
On we go.
On we go.
And after this, we're going to want to Dairy Queen.
So I want to go down two paths, and I'll tell you, let's tee up the two paths, and I'll let you pick which adventure you want to go down first. All right? So one is, I want to have a discussion about the history of land ownership in this country. We've done it before on this podcast. I want to do it again. I think it makes sense to talk about the history of federal ownership, state ownership. So I think that's one of them that we need to just run through real fast to talk about what are the legal roots of land ownership.
Can I make a Lewis and Clark reference?
Uh-huh.
Then let's do that one.
All right.
I'll choose that one.
Okay, but we're going to do both of them. It's just what you want to do first.
Okay.
Right. The second one is we're going to talk about what this appointment means for the Bureau of Land Management
Lewis
today.
and Clark, go.
Okay, so we'll do that, and then we'll come to what does this mean today. All right. So let's what's that song? Who sings the song "Going Back in Time"? We're going back.
Huey Lewis in the News.
Boom, you got it.
Yeah.
So Huey Lewis in the News. We're going back in time, like it's like we're getting our DeLorean, and we're gonna bypass the old West, and we're gonna go back to the founding fathers' time, right?
Tight socks, powdered wigs.
Man, I wish that would make a comeback. I'd love to see you in both of those.
You have? You haven't?
I haven't.
Go ahead.
All right. So here's how it all started. And let's see if I can get this right. And I want just to let you know, so you can verify all of our facts. I want to let you know what our reference is on this. I think that's fair to do, right?
Yes, the Congressional Research Service.
Congressional Research Service, a nonpartisan research service of Congress that puts together these reports.
Yes. We're really not making this up.
We're not making this up. This is coming from the Congressional Research Service. Right. So here's how it started. We're going back to the 1780s, and one of the things to allow statehood, we had our 13 original colonies. And some of those colonies owned a bunch of, they call it Western land. A bunch of land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River was owned by the original 13 states. Well, in order to be able to expand the country and create new states, and to have the states enter into the Union on equal footing, that land had to be ceded back to the federal government. So the original secession of lands really came from the original 13 states that ceded land back to the federal government between 1781 and 1802 to start the creation of new states. Then, from 1803 to 1867, through a number of land acquisitions, for example,
the Louisiana
Purchase, yep. Right? That's a great big one. And the culmination with the purchase of Alaska, Seward's Folly, right, in 1867. Yep. So through that, the federal government acquired 1.8 billion acres of land.
And they didn't even know what they had.
They didn't know what they had.
I mean, literally, no. Lewis and Clark got sent out because, they literally had no idea how big the holding was, what they had, whose stuff went where. And so, I like to try and put that in context because for people to understand this argument that the limited size of land that the federal government gets to hold and that's all they get to hold and have to dispose of, it comes from this period. It comes from understanding that at that point in time, when we got there in the DeLorean, that this is all they had. And you have to understand that when we got in the DeLorean and went in a few more years into the future, that suddenly there was more land and they had to figure out what to do with that land that they had. And so you had this expanding huge federal estate. If such was not the case, we're not the United States of America that we are today. If it weren't for those additional acts, those additional changes in what we had that belonged to our country, the federal government.
And while we were acquiring land, we were disposing of land. So, one of the arguments that Mr. Pendley makes in a number of his writings is that it was the intent of Congress, or not of Congress, it was the intent of the founding fathers to be disposing of property. And that's probably true. There was some intent back then to be disposing of property, and it plays out. I mean, we being the country, sold a lot of federal land to help pay Revolutionary War soldiers, to pay war debt, to pay off the national debt early in this in the infancy of this country, and then so that was one of the original policies for disposals. We had to pay for what we had.
Yeah,
right? We had to pay for infrastructure and all sorts of things.
Yeah,
we didn't have an income tax in 1776.
And later on, in order to encourage people to move into those lands that Lewis and Clark discovered that nobody wanted to live in, we had another act.
Exactly. We had the Homestead Act.
That said, hey, why don't you go out here, improve on lands, and the federal government, which owns this, will give it to you.
Right.
Which people did.
I mean, they did well into the 20th century.
And the interesting part about that, and we've talked about this on the podcast, is we got to a point where, to be frank, nobody wanted it anymore.
All the good stuff was taken.
Yeah, if there's the reason that your favorite antelope hunting place is public lands and there's not a stream anywhere nearby, and that's grazing land, is because if you could be homesteaded, it was. And frankly, any water that exists on that land, on that BLM land now, was probably an improvement project put in by landowners, or the BLM for landowners who was leasing it. So stock ponds or windmills, water mills with water tanks, stock tanks, that sort of thing. Improvements.
Spring improvements, yeah.
Somebody did that, and it wasn't, a ranger just for fun.
Right. The land, in the early 20th century, around 1910, 1920, there's a huge drop-off of settling because all of that good wet land, the bottom land, the irrigable land was taken, right? And so, we did have that policy, right? And that policy existed until 1976 with the passage of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. And we've talked about this act a lot, but this is the law that really firmed up and changed the policy formally.
Changed congressional intent formally.
Changed congressional intent formally.
We've shifted gears, bang.
Now, the other argument, so Congress had the intent of disposing of land and disposed of a lot of land over the course of the first almost 200 years of our history. And then the intent of Congress shifted, and it became maintaining the federal estate that we had, right? And managing that federal estate for multiple uses. Right. So
we're going to get back to this. And
that's the second piece of this for sure.
And I was going to say, here's the important thing to understand here. So what changed? Congressional intent changed. How is it expressed? An act of Congress.
Right. So now let's back up to some of the other arguments that I've seen Mr. Pendley and others make about this idea of land transfer. That the equal footing doctrine in the Constitution is effectively requires the transfer of lands to have,
so all states should it's got to be fair. Everybody enters the union on equal footing. Somebody doesn't get hammered when they come in.
Right, exactly. So the equal footing doctrine, for those that don't know, comes out of Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 of the Constitution. Just if you want to have, just for a point of reference, that's where it comes from. And the equal footing doctrine is the clause that talks about this is how states are going to be admitted to the Union. And the doctrine means that the equality of constitutional right and power is the condition of all states of the Union, old and new. One thing that the CRS report points out says it does not mean that physical or economic situations among states must be the same.
So you're saying Wyoming is not the same size as California?
Bingo. Or have the same economies or the same land ownership patterns?
You mean Idaho's a different shape than Montana is?
And
does Montana, do they both have the same amount of national parks?
Right.
Because that seems like that. No, I'm just saying that, like, to reference your point. I mean, you're right. There are nuances and differences, and as these states applied for statehood, there's an agreement between each of these states and the federal government, and conditions of as they gain their statehood, each of those had to go through an act of Congress as well. And there are and different states when they came in under nuanced differences. So even though they have the same base set of equal footing, that doesn't mean everything about their entrance into statehood is, it's not the same. They don't all have the exact same number of people. They don't have the exact same number of rivers. They don't. These are things there are nuanced differences.
Right. Every state's going to be a little bit different.
That's correct.
But the idea is they're going to come in with from a structural standpoint, political structure.
Yes.
On equal footing with other states.
A couple senators.
Right. Representative apportioned based on population.
Yes.
There's going to be fairness for all the states to have that representation.
Same representation and taxation schemes.
Right.
From a federal sense.
The federal laws will apply the same in all of the states. Right. The states will have the ability to write their own laws as long as they're consistent with the federal system.
Yes. The higher taxes that you're paying in California, those aren't federal taxes. You pay the same federal taxes that we do in Wyoming, even though your tax burden is ridiculously large because you have a beach.
Right. And so there have been people that have argued that this equal footing doctrine prohibits permanent federal land ownership. Except the Supreme Court has weighed in on that on several times and said that, well, that's just not true, right? That's just not true. So the federal government can own property. And in fact, it's spelled out explicitly in the property clause of the Constitution. We have a very specific clause in the Constitution called the property clause, and it is in, for those of you that want to reference it, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, and it says specifically this. It says, the Congress, I emphasize that, right? The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. These federal lands have been deemed property of the United States, and the Congress then has the authority to dispose of it if they'd like to, and that was a policy for a long time. But they also have the ability to make all other rules and regulations respecting that, which they've done through things like the Federal Land Policy and Management Act or the National Forest Management Act, the Multiple Use Sustain Yield Act. Congress has weighed in and said, here's how we want to see these federal lands managed. Okay, so go through our history. The Constitution is explicit that we can dispose of lands, but that power is left to Congress to determine whether we do or don't.
So know that there are, I guess, for me, and just backing up, so maybe I used this analogy before we were talking about it. There's a recipe for how this cake has to be baked.
Right, it involves Congress.
Yes. You can't change that recipe. It's not like somebody decides that they want to add something different they don't get to without, Congress is the one that decides how this thing bakes up in the end.
So let's put it, in simple terms. For those that are terrified that William Pendley is going to come in, and because his personal philosophy is disposal of federal lands, that he's going to embark on a mission to do just that, to dispose of federal lands.
So I was hoping to be able to purchase about 50 acres in Area 7, Laramie Peak, Elk Unit next month. I shouldn't be going to the bank for that loan yet?
Probably not. Okay. Now, we need to be clear. There's a provision in the Federal Land Policy and Management Act that allows for the disposition of federal lands. So Congress has already approved some disposal through that act, right? But not wholesale. It's very particular. You can do land exchanges. There's certain disposals that can occur, but not a wholesale. So he's limited by what Congress has said you can do. And he's limited by the fact that he's holding this position until September 30th.
Yes.
And we all know how fast things happen in Congress.
I think that's the challenge to understand here is that, we've talked about this some time ago, is that rightfully so, we should care about and be protective of, those great resources. And we have a different viewpoint here in the West because we live in them, right? But these national forests and BLM lands that we get to enjoy, we have a certain affinity for them and love for them, and we love to use them. But we need to remember as we talk, that as people who may have a different viewpoint than us on those lands, as they come in, this idea that tomorrow morning, this individual is going to sell off all your federal lands, that's not really fair. And we should not panic about it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be watchful. Doesn't mean you shouldn't care. But it does mean that, I question a little bit if you cry wolf too many times, say the sky is falling too many times, then, people start to get dead to your voice for things that maybe really matter.
Yeah. Now,
I don't want to. Okay, go ahead. So,
in
some ways, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't care, because there are other things that are impactful other than this idea that it's going to be transferred.
Right, and that's kind of what I was going to get at. So, a wholesale transfer, a fee title transfer of land, is virtually implausible at this point. I don't see Congress in a position of saying, you know what, we want to adopt that policy. We're going to change course over what we've been doing the past, 44 years or 43 years, whatever. We're going to change course over on that, and now we're going to go back to this disposal policy.
Pass a bill.
We're going to pass a bill
to be able to have that happen
through the Senate and the House, and reconcile the differences between the two, and then put it on the president's desk for signature, and have this program now in place to dispose of federal lands.
It's taken 10 years to get the some parts of the Sportsman's Act.
Right.
So, and that's bipartisan support on it.
So that's not going to happen. So the fear of an actual wholesale fee title transfer, I think we can all step back and say, come on, that's not going to happen. But what can happen? What can happen? And I think it's worth talking about that a little bit, because it's fair to be nervous. And I want to provide two different perspectives on this. Okay. I want to provide the perspective of folks that and I understand both sides of it. So I want to, the folks that are nervous about what can happen with this person in this role, and the folks that are excited about this person, about Pendley in this role. And I want to explain kind of both of those, because I think
you have friends on both sides.
Weird, right?
You're.
Can you believe that?
Yeah. You need to get on Facebook.
No, I think it's Twitter where the hate is spilled.
Go ahead.
Anyway, I know you don't have any friends on both sides.
I just don't have friends. Yeah. It's much simpler if you just avoid them.
If you just don't have them.
Yeah, just none.
Yeah. So let's talk about the side of, okay, how can people justifiably be nervous? Right? And let me start by saying, and I know you're in the same camp I am here, like we both value these public lands. We use them all the time. We recreate on them. They're a big part of our identity. They're a big part of what we do. Like our hunting life would be a lot different without these public lands. Like what we do recreationally would look a lot different.
But also remember, both of us have worked in capacities where we, have worked with energy interests, where we've worked with environmental interests. Both of us have friends who are both in conservation organizations, and friends who work in the oil and gas industry, and friends who are ranchers. And so I think we kind of get the flavor of all the different people at the table.
Right. And, I just came back from a 5-day deep backpacking trip in the deep wilderness of the Wind Rivers of Wyoming. And it was a phenomenal experience. And I'm so grateful to have that chunk of land where I can go in there and explore. I don't have to have ATVs, and I don't have to have snowmobiles, or I don't have to have all that. At the same time, I like going and doing that front country recreation at times too.
You know what I was doing? I was at a shooting sports competition that was held on a public shooting range that was county owned, also on neighboring federal lands that were permitted for that activity. And I was right by town.
Right.
Enjoying different types of lands and activities in the great outdoors.
Right. So we both do, all of this, right? But what could happen, right? The one thing, the argument that I've heard, and you're seeing some of it, we have an energy dominance policy, right? There's a policy right now from the president to to have energy independence and do whatever it takes to have energy independence. And that means developing our public lands to the maximum extent possible while trying to balance other uses on the landscape as well. So for those that are worried about this appointment, one of the things that could be an outgrowth of it, but I would asterisk and say, it doesn't matter. You could put anybody in that role. The outgrowth is going to be the same because it's the policy of the administration, not of the individual in that position. And that individual has to implement the policies of the administration.
That's right. And remember, people are policy. You say that all the time, but also remember, it matters how long somebody has to effectuate policy.
Sure. Absolutely. But you still have there's still time with this administration, and they might be elected again next year, and there could be
what I meant
plenty
is
of time. But
when you're in a temporary appointment for 100, till September 30th.
Sure.
It's important to keep this all in perspective.
Right, but he'll start something, and then the next person will continue that, and the next person will continue that as under the guise of this administration that has a policy directive that whoever is in this role has to meet.
That's right, and I think you said something that's important too, which is again. So let's take a step back and say, this individual, and we might be talking about. You might want to talk more about him, but what's the administration look like? So we have some idea where he comes from. I don't know if you're going to touch on that more, but what does his boss think? That's what's important.
Yeah, and by his boss, you mean the Secretary of Interior.
Yes.
Right, because in this administration, the buck stops with the Secretary of Interior.
Yes.
Some
people might, some secretaries, they might let somebody run wild. Not this guy.
No, he runs a very, very tight ship. Now, he's also responsible for implementing the president's policies, and he's going to make sure that's done. And so he's going to direct whomever is in that position to implement the policies a certain way. So regardless of who's in that position, the one thing that people that are fearful that they have to look at is they have to say, okay, what are the policies and how are they going to be implemented, and how does that affect the management of public lands? And one of the things that's out there right now is there's a much more aggressive leasing program. Like the idea is to get as many acres under lease for oil and gas exploration as possible in western states on BLM land, right? In particular, quarterly lease sales with many parcels up for sale. Now, just because something is leased, let me be very crystal clear.
Or up for lease.
Well, two-piece.
Okay.
Just because something is up for lease doesn't mean that it will be leased, and just because something is leased doesn't mean that it will be developed. And so
we're just talking about right
steps.
now. We're talking about minerals,
right?
Specifically, is what you're alluding to.
Exactly, and it's probably
minerals is going to be oil and gas and gravel and gold.
It can be anything, right? It can be all sorts of things.
You like that alliteration, gravel and gold?
Yeah, very nice. What are you going to do for oil and gas? How do you get alliteration out of that?
You can't.
I know. But that's a fear, and I think it's a reasonable concern for folks in the conservation community of, okay, even though there's not a wholesale land disposal, does leasing all of these acres effectively create a de facto transfer? And the reason I'd say it that way is by leasing these acres to private companies, the expectation is that those leases would be developed into an oil, gas, or whatever it is leased for resource, right? And so since there's that expectation, that land is going to be managed a different way than maybe some other lands. So by leasing large amounts of acres, you could effectively be changing the management scheme or the paradigm on these public lands, and maybe the priorities for those acres might be different. Once you've leased them for oil and gas development, you're not going to manage them for wilderness characteristics. That's not going to happen. Are you still going to have public land grazing? Yes. Are you still going to be able to hunt those lands? Yes. But are there going to be things that are going to be different? Yes. So in that regard, I can appreciate the concern with that folks are having with the appointment. But I would point out, like we've talked about before, that it doesn't matter who the appointment is. Now, this one raises flags just because of his background and some things he's written and so forth. But that's the other piece I want to talk about. Let's talk about his background and some of the things he's written. Sometimes I think the conservation community doesn't put themselves in the shoes of people that are on the ground, on the landscape every day and working with the federal government on a day in and day out basis to manage the federal resource of these public lands. I'm not going to do a wholesale blanket everybody, right? I don't want to do that. But why is it that you'd have somebody like William Perry William Pendley writing these articles about land transfers and writing these articles about the Sagebrush Rebellion and writing books? He has a list of books he's written, with titles like the Sagebrush Rebel, Reagan's Battle with Environmental Extremists and Why It Matters Today, Warriors for the West, Fighting Bureaucrats, Radical Groups, and Liberal Judges on America's Frontier, A War on the West, Government Tyranny on America's Great Frontier. Why does he write books like this, and why does he write articles like this?
Are you going to tell us, or do you?
I am. And then I'll tell a little bit, and then I'm sure you'll pile on too, right?
Yeah.
We've seen, and I'll give a couple Wyoming examples, and then you can pile on. We've seen this, right? The reason why he writes things like this is because there are people that have been on the landscape for generations, where they've had run-ins with the federal government, where there's just a gigantic trust breakdown. And I'll give a few examples.
I've got a big one too. So, go ahead.
So I'm going to give two, and then I'll let you do whatever you're going to do. So one involves the EPA, and one involves the National Forest Service.
Okay.
Right? So the EPA one, really quickly. And these are both Wyoming examples, but I'm sure you could replicate these other places. Through a rule-making process involving implementation of the Clean Air Act, right? The EPA changed the boundaries of the Wind River Indian Reservation and took 1,000 square miles of land that was Wyoming, right, including one of the larger communities in the state of Riverton, and through an administrative process put it and made it part of the reservation. And
redrew
the boundary. And the state of Wyoming had to litigate that and go to the, I can't remember which circuit, it might have been to the D.C. Circuit Court, and ultimately prevailed. I can't remember if it was D.C. or 10th Circuit, it doesn't matter. But Wyoming ultimately prevailed, and in that instance, the EPA was acting beyond its authority, for one thing, and did something that just, that kind of action takes an entire community and, pours this distrust on, just fuels a fire of distrust, right? There's one example. Then I'll give you a more localized example of, landowners.
Mine sounds better than yours. I'm so excited.
No, this is great, but it's good. So my other one is, let's take us to the Thunder Basin National Grassland of Northeast Wyoming. Right? Thunder Basin National Grassland has one of the largest black-tailed prairie dog complexes in North America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that place.
Gigantic, tens of thousands of acres of prairie dog colonies on the Thunder Basin National Grassland, and they expand and they.
I thought you were going to say tens of thousands of targets. Sorry,
no, tens of thousands of acres. Anyway, these colonies expand, and they're doing very well on the national grassland, but there's intermixed private land throughout that, and the private landowners don't really want them there. They've been poisoning for a long time, trying to remove prairie dogs because they're high density. They remove forage for livestock, and then
90% of it.
It affects the bottom line of the rancher, right?
Mm-hmm.
For decades, the Forest Service has tried to make commitments to these landowners. They've said, we are going to fund boundary control. We're going to do all this management to ensure that these prairie dogs don't encroach upon your private land. We're going to keep them on the national grassland. They make all of these commitments and then break the commitments, right? And then change the game. They make commitments one year, and then the next year want to say a new supervisor comes into the region and says, I know that's the way we did it before. Now this is the way we're going to do it now. And the landowners never know the playing field's always changing. The goalposts are always moving. Right? They don't know. They don't know how to operate on the landscape, and all they're trying to do.
They feel a little bit like Charlie Brown, and
the football
keeps getting jerked out.
Yeah, and so that's built a bunch of distrust. And those are two examples that you can replicate all over the West that I have, and I know you've got one too.
Yeah, there's a great one, and I think everybody listening is aware of it, which is Bears Ears. So there are two monuments. So it's San Rafael is the other one, right? This is the swell. In Utah, and I think Utah, when you talk about the original Sagebrush Rebellion, kind of its infancy, was very much ground zero. It was very much the state of Utah, and there's a lot of these arguments we've talked about, the equal footing doctrine and all that get referred to very frequently in relation to this. But the big complaint of the state of Utah and many people in the state of Utah was this regarding those monument designations, is that basically they're saying that you really didn't care what we think. You didn't care what we wanted. The federal government, some bureaucrat comes in and makes a decision about lands that affect us in the state of Utah and our ability to make a living and our ability to live in these communities. And so that creates a lot of distrust. And so in that case, these states felt, they really feel like, these people who have to live with these lands and have to ranch around here or work in oil and gas industry, they feel like they would rather work with somebody else. They feel like their livelihoods are imperiled every time the administration changes and somebody comes in, just like we feel like, right? Like just like a recreational user might feel like their recreational lands are imperiled, and it leads them to feel one way and to be fearful of one thing. A landowner or somebody who wakes up in the morning and tries to pay for his kid's health insurance by working for the oil and gas industry, that guy feels a different way when there's a different administration and a different person comes in. They have a real trepidation that their way of life is in jeopardy.
Huh. Or think about the recreational user that has been running an ATV down a trail for years and years, and then one year the Forest Service or the BLM says, it's been causing too much resource damage. We're shutting this trail down. And they do it without going through a real comment period. They do it because they view they have to prevent resource damage. Those folks that had used that trail for so many years are impacted by it, and there's now they are just distrusting the federal government too, right? And so there's a lot of
reasons people feel the way that they do.
There are, and unless you've lived through it, it's hard to understand it. And a lot of I know there's going to be a lot of folks in cities that don't spend a lot of time on these lands that are saying, "Good, you know what? We don't care. It's all of our lands. It shouldn't be managed just for the landowner, the lessee. It shouldn't be to run cattle. It shouldn't be managed just for oil and gas." And
and there are people who are in that other community who are saying, this is not, saying we are, this is our state. We live here. We are not a national park.
Right. And they're saying this
is our town.
Just because it's federal land doesn't mean it should be set aside as everything should be a park or everything should be a wilderness.
Yeah.
And it's
diverse interests coming together. And trying to live on the same landscape.
So I completely understand both perspectives.
Yes.
And I'm sympathetic to both perspectives, right? Which is why if you can be sympathetic to both perspectives, and I hope other people can be, I think that's where you find some solutions that work, and that's where you get true multiple use. Is when you can be sympathetic to other people's interests, and when you can recognize that there's large value to having landowners out there leasing lands and grazing, right?
And I would say there's large value to a state and community to having a strong recreation economy that helps support you no matter what commodities prices are.
Right. And that recreational community is a diverse user base. So you've got to have front country opportunities. You've got to have back country opportunities. You've got to balance some of those interests too. But, a lot of those uses require some fuel to get there to be able to recreate. So you have to be respectful of the fact that, there are places where, we are going to have to develop for energy until we have some other source that can replace the sources that we're relying upon
Like a fusion reactor that you put vegetables in and it makes the flux capacitor work.
Right. Once that happens, Mr. Fusion, isn't that what it was called? I think it was called Mr. Fusion.
Mr. Fusion, yep, on the DeLorean.
On the DeLorean.
Yep.
Yeah. Until you have Mr. Fusion, we got to get our energy from somewhere.
Yeah.
And part of that source is going to be from our public lands, and we got to figure out how to balance that use with these other uses. And
it's not easy, and I think too often people want it to be the easy answer, and the easy answer is a myth. There is no easy answer.
There's not.
And in our country right now, I think, hammered home again for me, consensus is too often now viewed as a dirty word, and as if by coming to consensus on something we're somehow giving up. We're not. That's not what consensus means. It doesn't mean give up. Consensus means we all recognize that we need a sandwich. And, just because Dave doesn't get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and I don't get a steak sandwich doesn't mean that we're not both going to have a sandwich, but we can both decide that turkey's okay.
Yeah.
And that's the problem right now. We all have to get to that point where we're okay to give a little bit. It doesn't mean you lost. It just means that let's find something we can all take. We're going to share this sandwich, so let's work together to build it.
So here's my takeaway on the appointment of William Pendley. Right? No matter which side you're on, whether you're excited about his appointment or whether you're really nervous about his appointment, one thing is the same. We have a series of laws in place by Congress that, one, prevent the wholesale transfer of land to states or private citizens, and two, dictate how management should occur. We have all of those, and we've got accompanying regulations, and what those things do, regardless of where you are, what you're thinking is about this, is it allows for the public to hold these officials accountable for their actions. So all I would say is, if you're nervous, watch closely. As planning documents come out or proposed regulation changes come out, be prepared to comment. Have your thoughts lined out. Comment on the documents. Participate in the public process that helps set the policy. If you're supporting him, same thing. There's this process to hold him accountable to make sure he's doing what you want to see him doing. That's why we have this structure in place of all these laws, and that's where. I think that's where the engagement can be. It's not on an action alert saying, tell your congressman to oppose this nomination. Circling back to jab land a little bit here, but
he deserves it.
It's not, tell your congressman, we're not going to fund the agency if you're going to appoint somebody like this to this position. No, I don't, that's not the way to do it. But I mean, the way to do it is to say, we've got this series of laws in place that create accountability for these officials, and our job is to hold them accountable to what the current congressional intent is. And the congressional intent is supposed to be the intent of the people, right? And so it's the people holding the officials accountable to the intent of Congress when they pass these laws. That's where I sit as I'm looking at this. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Nephi.
My thoughts are, we live in a country right now that is playing where too many people are playing very heavily on sound bites and us versus them. And, from the first podcast, you remember me talking about like this whole kumbaya thing, but I will tell you, we need it now more than ever, is for people to quit playing an us versus them mentality of the world, and that is less informed and volatile. We need to live. We need to be the people. Everybody listen to this. You guys are those people. And because I know our listeners, we tend to have a pretty highbrow listener that cares about policy issues and studies them. We need to be the people that can be that can tell people to take a deeper dive, and that can explain it a little bit better, and calm the rhetoric, and quench the fires a little bit, and bring people to the same table to work on problems together, because there's just way too much going on today of this whole divide and conquer type of mentality, and that that the ultimate purpose is something else. It's not even William Perry Pendley, who cares? He's not going to be here after September 30th.
Well, he might be. He could be renewed.
But why? Yeah. But I mean, but again, if you go up a level to Secretary Bernhardt, you're going to know a whole lot better about what the policy really is. And we need to keep your eye on the prize of the reality of long term, what we want, how we want lands managed, what we want to see as our end goal of recreation and everything else. And if you continue to burn bridges on things that don't really matter, you don't have ammunition for the things that do.
Yeah. His appointment, and
I'm just saying that. It's just like it's in a general thought.
Just make sure we're not saying
and I'm not
his appointment doesn't matter.
And my statement about that is based on other things that I'm seeing in the political climate and other issues. It's not, for him, I see this as just a, I'm concerned about the microcosm of bomb throwing and that tends to be out there and tends to be popularized in Facebook and everything else today, that I just want to go like, come on, guys, let's be better than that.
Yeah, and so I said I had that was the last thing. Here's one more last thing. I'm a big proponent of our public lands. I don't want, and I said this earlier in the podcast, right? I don't want to see them transferred.
Just 50 acres for me.
Just the 50 acres for you and 150 for me. Just kidding. I don't want to see our public lands transferred. I want to see public lands remain in the federal estate.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't want to see them sold off. I'm as passionate as anybody on that's out there.
Me too.
Right.
Me
I
too.
know you are. Yet, I'm not terrified with this appointment that's going to happen.
It's
and that's a point I want to make. Do I have criticisms of this? Yeah, I think it's a little unusual I almost think it's in some ways intentionally putting somebody in that role to kind of.
It's almost a shite. Like you've said this to you before. It's like some people need to,
It's like a shock value thing.
It's
right?
like a bright, shiny object that you need to recognize. If you're fundraising as a gift.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I
like,
I almost think
if you're trying to grow your membership, like you should write a letter of thanks.
I almost think in some ways it's like, you know what? I know this is going to piss a bunch of people off, and that's why I'm going to do it. And so, so I keep that in my mind too. I'm just saying that a little tongue in cheek.
I do want to follow up exactly on something you just said when you talked about, your idea in public lands and how you're passionate about them. I am too. A thing that does, I think, it bothers me, and it's a challenge, I think, is where we all agree, you and I agree, and I think a lot of people agree, they want to see these lands remain there so that they can be used and for all these things that we cherish so much for future generations. I also, on the other side of that coin, it scares me, and I think it scares a lot of people in, like a ranching community, when they think that somebody else, just like there's groups that are afraid of these lands being taken over and then sold to the highest bidder, there are other groups that are afraid of these lands being taken over and them excluded by one use. So where some groups consider like, oh, they're going to sell it to some guy and it's going to become a big ranch and I can't use it. Realize that there are families making a living just barely trying to, whether they're cattle ranchers or they work in the oil and gas industry or it's a coal miner that just got laid off. Those people are looking at, they're scared to death when they see environmental interests and they think those guys are trying to kick us off of these public lands. And they are their lands too. They are multiple use lands, and recognize, that fear. Both of those fears are valid. And if we allow ourselves as a country to be driven by the worst among us on either side of that to opposite corners, we all lose.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna be very specific to the agriculture community here because I'm unabashed supporter of the agriculture industry, right? And I think I've been pretty clear about that. And I've said this time too. I'm going to say it again. And this is just specific to their use on public lands. Most of them that have large leases on public lands, without those leases, they couldn't run their business. They'd cease to exist as a viable family business. And what would happen? They'd sell. They'd sell to a corporate interest. They'd sell to somebody that would come in and subdivide. Maybe there's somebody that gives access. They'd sell to somebody that would come in and shut gates, right?
You've seen that happen, right? The crazy
happen
mountains.
a lot, yeah. So there are, in my mind, so many negatives that can happen from losing the rancher that has the lease on the public lands, because as you mentioned at the very beginning of this, and we talked about with the Homestead Act, the best lands, the most productive lands, which means the lands that are incredibly crucial for the elk and the deer and the pronghorn and everything that we like to hunt and the wildlife we like to see out there, that's on the privately held land. And if that land is sold and subdivided and people are putting houses on it, which happens, look at the Pinedale area, look at the Jackson and the Cody area. Look at Bozeman, right? That happens. And when that happens, you lose habitat. And when you lose habitat, your numbers decrease, which means even though you have the same amount of federal land, your opportunities as a hunter just went down because that private landowner couldn't make a going of it anymore because somebody pushed out that interest, right? So that's a very important multiple use on the public landscape. And they should be at the table with the hunting community and others talking about how should we be managing these public lands so that we can have this robust wildlife population for that you and I and a lot of our listeners go out to enjoy every fall. So that's my soapbox rant about just that one use. I'm not going to go into all the other uses out there, but just that one use, because I need to throw out and it's I get it. People are going to say that
There's a reason that wildlife interests are super excited about the Farm Bill every year and push for it. Yeah. There's also a reason that Aldo Leopold said the future of conservation of wildlife lies in private lands.
You got it.
And it wasn't because he's thinking everything was going to be private. It's because he recognized, living in the West, and as a guy who had a farm, and he recognized the importance of this whole world working together, living together, coming to a consensus around this table of what we love.
You got it. So that's the advice to everybody out there, right? You try and respect everybody's opinions, reach across the aisle, really listen and understand other people's perspectives, participate in the public process. Those are the ways that we ensure that we have our public lands to enjoy. We don't want to fall into these divisive camps where it becomes an all-out war over how the public land should be managed. We need to respect each other and recognize that there are multiple uses and there are multiple interests, and they each have valid points. And if we can get to that point, we can probably get to a place where we're going to have pretty good access and pretty good wildlife populations and pretty well-managed public lands. And don't worry, the congressional intent will remain the same, and we'll have those public lands for our future generations to enjoy.
And if the Secretary of Interior kicks you out of his office so you can't tell him personally why you don't like a nominee, rethink the way you're doing business.
Fact. That wasn't directed at me.
I was looking at you when I said
I know you were looking right into my soul. Like, I've never been kicked out of his office. Anyway, hey, thanks for listening. If you have other ideas, other topics, like we said at the beginning, shoot us an email, yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com, and we'll do a little digging and we'll try and put together a podcast for you. And just remember, as always, that life is about experiences, so go have one.